The Belgic, sunken ship number 14 in Deer Lake. Over the past few years, I found many sunken boats in Deer Lake. Today, while running my Side Scan Sonar, I spotted the outline of number 14, just north of Wanakawin in about 25 feet of water. As I find them, I've made a tradition of naming them after the sunken ships from the White Star Line, brethren of the Titanic. I'm naming this one the Belgic. Always ready for another adventure, I dropped my underwater drone down onto it. Back in the 1960s, when many resorts were in full swing, they all rented out wooden-framed, metal-skinned rowboats for fishing, very similar in construction to this small example. Many of them ended their days resting and fading into history on the bottom of our lake. The one I found today is quite large as rowboats go, with 4 seating positions and double sets of oarlocks. So join me now as we descend on the Belgic, and likely be the first eyes to see it in half a century. This is the Deer Lake Diver. I wanted to make note, those of you that have been on dives with me before, notice that every single structure, every one that I dive on, is usually covered in the invasive species of smallmouth bass that we have here. We have a burgeoning problem with those smallmouth bass. However, on this structure, you don't see a single smallmouth bass, not one. And I believe that to be the case because this is a major hunting ground for the large Mackinaw that we just saw, and they keep the smallmouth bass populations down. A large mac is the only fish in our lake that can actually chase down a breeding size smallmouth bass. Those Mackinaw are very important to our lake.